By the spring of 1945, the skies over Europe had changed forever. The Luftwaffe, once the dominant air force of the continent, had been shattered. Thousands of aircraft had been destroyed, experienced pilots were gone, and Germany's industrial base had been crippled by relentless bombing. The courage and ingenuity displayed by Britain during the Battle of Britain and the subsequent air campaigns had set the stage for the final defeat of the Third Reich. The numbers tell the story. During the Battle of Britain alone, roughly 2,927 Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed, compared to about 1,733 RAF aircraft. Over 1,500 pilots were killed, yet the RAF remained operational and resilient. Civilians endured the Blitz, with over 43,000 killed and more than 1 million homes destroyed, but morale never broke. The technological edge, radar-guided night fighters, code-breaking at Bletchley Park, and innovations in navigation and aircraft amplified the efforts of the few into a force that could control the skies. The human stories were as remarkable as the numbers. Polish, Czech, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand pilots risked everything alongside British comrades. The ground crews, often overlooked, worked day and night to keep aircraft flying. Women of the WAF coordinated radar stations, telegraph lines, and plotting rooms, becoming essential to every interception. Civilians, too, played their part, rescuing neighbors, manning fire brigades, and keeping the fabric of society intact amid the chaos. Each role, no matter how small it seemed, contributed to the ultimate victory. Churchill's phrase, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," became immortal. But it was more than rhetoric, it was truth. The resilience of Britain's air defense created a domino effect. It prevented German invasion, allowed time for Allied planning, and gave hope to occupied nations that resistance was possible. Without control of the skies, the success of D-Day and the liberation of Europe might never have been achieved. The legacy of the Battle of Britain extended beyond immediate military results. It changed the psychology of the war. Hitler's forces had encountered for the first time a nation that refused to submit, a country that could absorb punishment, adapt, and fight back with ingenuity and courage. The RAF demonstrated that technological innovation, centralized command, and human bravery could overcome numerical superiority. The principles established, early warning, fighter coordination, night defense, and aircrew training, became blueprints for modern air combat doctrine. But perhaps the most lasting impact was cultural. The stories of individual pilots, their dogfights, camaraderie, and sacrifice, inspired generations. Films, books, and later documentaries preserved the memory of the few. Monuments were erected, museums built, and streets named to honor the men and women who defended Britain. Children learned about the green radar screens, the roar of Spitfires, and the courage required to fly into skies filled with death. These tales transcended statistics. They became moral and historical lessons about resilience, determination, and the human capacity to face overwhelming odds. Even today, historians debate the strategic and tactical details, but the essential truth remains. Britain's resistance in the air turned the tide of World War II. It bought time, preserved a nation, and set in motion the chain of events that would lead to Allied victory. The pilots who once scrambled from grass airfields, the ground crews who patched engines in the dark, the civilians who endured nightly bombings, all became part of a collective legend. Victory came not from one battle, but from the cumulative effect of strategy, bravery, and ingenuity. The Battle of Britain was a testament to the human spirit under pressure, showing that courage, unity, and determination can change the course of history. From the chaos of smoke-filled skies to the silent victories of codebreakers, from the roar of Spitfires to the quiet endurance of civilians, Britain had proven something extraordinary: that an island, seemingly alone, could stand against the mightiest war machine in history and prevail. The skies that had once been filled with fear were now empty of German dominance. The few had fought, the nation had endured, and the world had witnessed the birth of a legend. A story of defiance, resilience, and ultimate triumph that would inspire humanity for generations. By 1944, the skies over Europe had changed completely. The RAF, strengthened by years of experience, technological advancement, and new aircraft, now flew alongside American heavy bombers in massive formations that could reach deep into the Reich. Spitfires, Mustangs, and Tempests dominated the day. Mosquitoes and de Havilland intruders prowled the night. Britain had transformed from a besieged island into an air superpower. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, was a shadow of its former self. Pilot losses had been catastrophic, aircraft production struggled under Allied bombing, and fuel shortages made even routine sorties perilous. Germany had underestimated the resilience of the British people, the ingenuity of their scientists, and the ability of their air force to adapt. Now, every engagement over Europe was a desperate gamble for survival. The preparation for Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, demanded absolute control of the air. RAF and USAF bombers relentlessly targeted railways, bridges, and airfields across France, Holland, and Belgium, softening German defenses and disrupting reinforcements. Fighter sweeps, known as rodeos and ramrods, hunted Luftwaffe planes preemptively, ensuring that German pilots had little chance to counter the invasion. From airfields in southern England, pilots climbed into dawn skies with grim determination. Some were veterans who had flown since the Battle of Britain, their faces etched with lines of fatigue and focus. Others were fresh recruits, eager to prove themselves in the climactic chapters of the war. The sky was a canvas of engines, contrails, and tracer fire. Bomber streams stretched for miles, escorted by agile fighters ready to dive into dogfights at any moment. German pilots faced a nightmare they could not escape. Night after night, Allied bombers destroyed cities and industrial centers. By day, fighters and fighter bombers strafed airfields and supply depots. Morale crumbled as Luftwaffe leadership struggled to respond effectively. Pilots whispered tales of the invisible enemy, radar-directed interceptions, decoy formations, and relentless pressure that left little room for planning. Yet even in desperation, Germany fought fiercely. The Luftwaffe launched last-ditch attacks on Allied airfields in France, attempted V-weapon launches against London, and deployed jet fighters like the Me-262 to try to regain the initiative. Each attack was bold but costly. Allied pilots, aided by radar and superior numbers, met them with unrelenting precision. For every German aircraft destroyed, the Reich could replace only a fraction. The civilian populations in Britain watched and waited. Memories of the Blitz lingered. Rooftops blackened, families torn apart. The echo of air raid sirens still vivid. But now they witnessed victory in the making. Each return of a bomber squadron, each intercepted raid, reinforced the idea that their perseverance had not been in vain. Britain was no longer on the defensive. It was shaping the course of history. By June 6, 1944, D-Day arrived. The air over Normandy was thick with Allied aircraft. Paratroopers descended behind enemy lines. Bombers flattened defensive positions. Fighters strafed roads and railways. The Luftwaffe, weakened beyond recovery, could only attempt minor disruptions. The skies belonged to the Allies. In Berlin, panic and disbelief took hold. Hitler's generals reported that the Western Front was collapsing under combined air and land power. Hitler raged at the radio, blaming cowardice, incompetence, and fate. For Britain, however, the moment was triumph, a vindication of 4 years of endurance, sacrifice, and strategy. The pilots of the Battle of Britain, long remembered as the few, now saw their efforts echoed across the continent. They had bought time, preserved the nation, and ensured that the tide of war had turned. The final struggle in the air would continue until 1945, but the trajectory was clear. The Luftwaffe was no longer an unstoppable force. The skies that once threatened Britain now served as corridors of liberation for Europe. The courage of RAF pilots, the genius of British technology, and the unyielding spirit of civilians had created a foundation for victory. What had started as a desperate fight for survival had become a symbol of resilience, innovation, and hope that would inspire generations to come. The story of Britain's air war, from Dunkirk to D-Day, was not just about aircraft or strategy. It was about determination, unity, and the belief that freedom was worth defending at any cost. While the roar of engines and the glow of burning cities filled the night skies, another battle, silent, unseen, and just as deadly, was being fought in the shadows. It was the war of intelligence, of frequencies and codebooks, of scientists and spies. It was the moment when Britain's greatest weapon became not the Spitfire, but the mind. At the heart of this invisible conflict stood Bletchley Park, a quiet Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire that hid one of the greatest secrets of the war. Behind its ivy-covered walls, mathematicians, linguists, and chess champions worked day and night to break the German Enigma code, the cipher machine believed by the Nazis to be unbreakable. Each day, Enigma's operators in the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht sent thousands of encrypted messages, their contents vital to operations across Europe. If the Allies could read them, they could see into Hitler's war machine itself. Among the codebreakers was Alan Turing, a brilliant, eccentric mathematician who spoke in logic as easily as others spoke in words. He and his team built the bomb, a massive electromechanical device designed to test thousands of possible Enigma settings every minute. In the cold, humming rooms of Bletchley, the machine clicked, whirred, and stopped, each pause meaning another piece of the German war puzzle had been unlocked. By 1941, the codebreakers were reading Luftwaffe communications almost in real time. Fighter command knew where bomber formations were heading even before radar screens lit up. Entire squadrons were scrambled preemptively, meeting German planes the moment they crossed the channel. What had once seemed like instinct or luck was now precision, powered by pure intellect. But Bletchley wasn't the only place where the unseen war raged. Across Britain, new radar networks evolved rapidly. The chain home system, once designed for early warning, was now joined by more advanced airborne radar, allowing British night fighters to hunt German bombers under cover of darkness. The introduction of the AI Mk-4 radar set revolutionized the night skies. Crews of twin-engine Bristol Beaufighters and later de Havilland Mosquitoes used radar screens the size of dinner plates to track enemy planes through the dark. The hunter could finally see the hunted. For the first time, the night belonged to Britain. One German bomber pilot later recalled, "We used to say the British flew with eyes in the dark. We never saw them coming, only the tracer fire that tore through the fuselage." At the same time, British intelligence waged war on the airwaves. Countermeasures known as window, bundles of aluminum strips dropped from aircraft, created false echoes on German radar, confusing their defenses and leading anti-aircraft gunners to fire at ghosts. It was deception at its finest, science turned into illusion. The result was devastating for the Luftwaffe. Their bombers, once masters of the night, began to fall in record numbers. Navigation grew harder, morale crumbled, and confidence in Göring's promises faded fast. The skies that had once belonged to Germany were now filled with uncertainty and fear. On the ground, Bletchley's analysts began to piece together more than just air raids. They tracked supply lines, troop movements, and the shifting focus of the German war effort. Every decoded message painted a clearer picture of the Reich's strategy. Churchill, one of the few men who knew the truth, referred to Bletchley's intelligence as his golden eggs. The information saved countless lives and shortened the war by years. By 1943, the combination of code-breaking, radar innovation, and night interception had turned the tide of the air war. The Luftwaffe, once a symbol of Nazi dominance, was now bleeding from 1,000 invisible cuts. German pilots entered combat unsure whether their radios were secure, whether their radars were lying, or whether the enemy already knew their every move. War had evolved beyond bombs and bullets. It had become a chess match between minds, and Britain was winning. The Battle of Britain had been fought in the clouds. Now the battle of intelligence was being fought in silence, with logic and light instead of fire and steel. The men and women who fought it never flew a plane, never fired a gun, but they struck the enemy just as hard. By the dawn of 1941, Britain had endured 6 relentless months of night raids. The Blitz had turned London into a landscape of broken glass and smoke, but the nations will remained unbroken. Churchill knew the time had come to do more than survive. It was time to hit back. Deep inside the Air Ministry, a new doctrine was forming. The RAF's Bomber Command, once a secondary force, would become Britain's long arm of revenge. Their mission was simple but terrifying: to bring the war home to Germany. At first, the challenge seemed impossible. Early bombers like the Wellington and Whitley were slow, lightly armed, and often lost their way in the darkness. Navigation over Europe was a nightmare. Pilots used stopwatches, maps, and guesswork to find their targets. Some crews never returned, vanishing into the night over the North Sea. The casualty rate was brutal. But Britain had something Germany didn't: scientists who were quietly inventing the future. In underground labs and secret workshops, they developed radar-guided navigation systems like G and H2S, capable of detecting the ground's shape through cloud and darkness. The same technology that had saved Britain's skies was now being used to find German cities in the dead of night. By the spring of 1942, a new generation of aircraft joined the fight. The Avro Lancaster, a steel giant capable of carrying more than 6 tons of bombs, more than any plane before it. Its 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines gave it a deep, throbbing hum that every crewman learned to love. "You didn't fly a Lancaster," one pilot said. "You rode its heartbeat." The missions were long, cold, and deadly. Crews took off at dusk, climbing into freezing altitudes where the air was thin and black. Inside the cabins, temperatures dropped below zero. Frost grew on oxygen masks. The dull red glow of instrument panels reflected in tired eyes. They flew over occupied Europe, watching German searchlights sweep the sky like pale claws, flak bursts exploding around them in orange blossoms. The first major turning point came in May 1942, the 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne. For the first time, Britain assembled over 1,000 bombers for a single operation. The night sky became a river of engines and vapor trails, a metallic storm flowing eastward. The sheer sight of it stunned even the pilots. One recalled, "We looked left and right and saw wings stretching to the horizon. For once, we weren't alone." That night, Cologne burned for hours. Over 2,000 tons of bombs were dropped, destroying vast industrial zones and sending a clear message to Berlin: Britain could strike back. The cost was enormous. 41 aircraft never returned. Hundreds of airmen were lost or captured. But morale soared. The hunted had become the hunters. Newspapers declared, "The bombers are Britain's answer." Inside Bomber Command, a quiet rivalry grew between the engineers and the crews. The scientists raced to improve targeting and bomb loads. The pilots learned to navigate with deadly precision. Out of this partnership came innovations that would define the air war, from the bouncing bombs of Operation Chastise to the Pathfinder squadrons that marked targets with flares. But behind every raid was tragedy. Many aircraft went down over occupied Europe, their crews buried in foreign soil. Families at home received telegrams that began with the same cold words, "Regret to inform you?" Yet still, new volunteers arrived every week. They knew the odds and flew anyway. The shift from defense to offense changed Britain's psychology. No longer a cornered island, it had become a striking force. Cities still burned, but now so did enemy factories. For the first time since Dunkirk, the British people felt momentum. Churchill, always the voice of endurance, spoke to the nation: "If the German people bring war to our cities, then we shall give them war in kind. For as long as it takes, and by every means at our disposal." From the skies above Cologne to the depths of Berlin, that promise was kept. The sound of British bombers became the heartbeat of a nation that refused to die. The victory in the skies had not ended the war, it had changed its shape. Defeated in daylight, the Luftwaffe returned under cover of darkness. On the evening of September 7, 1940, London's night sky turned crimson. The first great raid of the Blitz had begun. Thousands of Londoners watched as the horizon glowed with the reflection of fires spreading through the East End. German bombers came in waves, 348 in the first assault, followed by hundreds more through the night. They dropped nearly 300 tons of high explosives and thousands of incendiaries. The docks, warehouses, and crowded working-class neighborhoods burned for hours. The Thames shimmered with flames. Inside the city, chaos reigned. Fire brigades fought through collapsing streets, water hoses hissing as they sprayed molten debris. Ambulance sirens wailed. The smell of burning timber, oil, and brick dust filled the air. Families carried what they could: a suitcase, a cat, a family photograph, and ran for the underground stations. The tunnels of the London Underground became life-saving sanctuaries. Entire families slept on platforms, shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in blankets as bombs thundered above. By dawn, the city was scarred. Hundreds dead, thousands homeless, but still alive. And the next night, the bombers came again. And again. For 57 consecutive nights, London was bombed without pause. Other cities soon followed. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Bristol, Sheffield, Glasgow. The Luftwaffe's new goal was terror, to break the British spirit by burning its cities to the ground. But what Hitler and Göring didn't understand was that terror had the opposite effect. It welded Britain together. Civilians began to show the same quiet courage that pilots had shown in the skies. Firefighters, nurses, and volunteers from the Air Raid Precaution Service, the ARP, became the new front line. They dug through rubble to save trapped neighbors, carried the wounded through smoke-filled streets, and extinguished fires with buckets when the water mains were destroyed. The King and Queen visited bombed districts in person, walking through ash-covered streets to comfort survivors. When Buckingham Palace itself was hit, the Queen famously declared, "I'm glad we've been bombed. Now we can look the East End in the eye." Churchill, ever defiant, visited ruins by torchlight, his cigar glowing like a signal in the dark. "We can take it," he told Londoners. "We can take it." His words, broadcast nightly, became a shield against despair. But the human cost was immense. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. The raid on Coventry in November 1940, Operation Moonlight Sonata, left the medieval city in ruins. More than 500 people were killed in a single night. The Luftwaffe used Pathfinder aircraft to mark targets with flares, then sent waves of bombers to level them. Factories, hospitals, homes, all erased in hours. The smell of burning lingered for days. And yet, Britain did not break. In the morning, trams still ran. Milk was still delivered. Children went to school, even as their classrooms shook from nearby explosions. A British journalist wrote, "We do not fight with guns or tanks. We fight by keeping our lives running, by having tea in the ruins." What made this defiance possible was not just courage but preparation. The Home Guard, air defense networks, and civil protection systems worked with astonishing coordination. Anti-aircraft guns lit up the night, their tracer rounds streaking upward like fiery ladders. Searchlights swept the clouds, catching bombers in their beams before the fighters rose to meet them. Londoners learned to read the sounds of engines, the slow drone of Heinkels, the shriek of falling bombs, the eerie silence that came before an explosion. In pubs, blackout curtains hung thick, and people whispered jokes to keep their spirits alive. "If Hitler wants to see London, tell him to come in daylight," someone quipped. There was laughter, not from amusement but from survival. By winter, the Blitz had destroyed more than 1 million homes and killed over 40,000 civilians. But it had also created something unbreakable, a shared sense of endurance that no bomb could shatter. When American journalist Edward R. Murrow broadcast from a London rooftop during a raid, his words carried across the Atlantic. "This is London. It is now nearly 2 a.m. The fires are still burning, but the people are unbroken." The world listened, and realized that Britain was standing alone, not defeated, but defiant. September 15, 1940. A date that would later be remembered as Battle of Britain Day. The morning began like so many others. Clear skies over southern England, radar screens lighting up, and the calm voice of a controller saying, "Raid approaching, 200 plus, heading London." But this time something was different. Fighter command wasn't broken. It wasn't exhausted. It was ready. In operations rooms across Britain, the phone lines buzzed. Squadrons scrambled from airfields at Northolt, Hornchurch, and Biggin Hill. The system that Hugh Dowding and Keith Park had built, the intricate web of radar, observers, and command posts, now worked with flawless precision. When the first waves of bombers appeared over the channel, RAF fighters were already waiting for them. As the bombers crossed the coast, the sky erupted. Hurricanes dove head-on into Heinkels, machine guns blazing. Spitfires swooped from above to cut off their escorts. Messerschmitt 109s tried to defend the bombers but were drawn into swirling dogfights that dragged them away from their charges. From the ground, people could see hundreds of contrails twisting and colliding like white scars in the blue. The air thundered with the sound of engines and gunfire. A British pilot described it later. There were so many aircraft that the sky looked alive. Wings flashing in the sunlight, smoke trailing from burning engines. You didn't have time to think. You just flew and fought. By noon, London's defenders had thrown everything they had into the battle. At one point, the control room in Uxbridge, where Churchill himself was watching the plot table, received a report. There are no reserves left. Churchill, grim-faced, asked, "How many fighters are in the air?" "Every one, sir," came the answer. What happened next changed the war. The Luftwaffe's formations began to disintegrate under the coordinated strikes. Bombers broke off, dropping their loads early, some turning back before reaching the city. Radio chatter among German pilots filled with panic. "Too many Spitfires. They're everywhere." British fighters chased retreating bombers across the channel, pressing the attack to the very edge of their fuel limits. That evening, the results were staggering. The Luftwaffe lost nearly 60 aircraft in one day, twice the RAF's losses. For the first time, Britain had not only survived but decisively struck back. At dusk, when the last fighters returned to their bases, ground crews cheered. Mechanics waved oil-stained rags. Women of the WAF embraced pilots still trembling from adrenaline. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was proof that Germany could be beaten in the air. For Göring and his commanders, the day was a disaster. The Luftwaffe had thrown its best squadrons into the fight and failed. Their losses were unsustainable, their morale shaken. German pilots, once confident of swift victory, began to call the channel the Moat of Death. In Berlin, reports were grim. Hitler had expected the RAF to be wiped out within weeks. Now, even his generals began to doubt the feasibility of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. Without control of the skies, an invasion fleet would be suicide. German landing barges quietly returned to port. The dream of conquering Britain began to fade into mist. But for Britain, the victory was more than strategic, it was spiritual. Across the nation, people listened to Churchill's voice crackle over the radio. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The words rang through air raid shelters, pubs, and factories. They weren't just about pilots. They were about everyone who had kept the island standing. Radar operators, mechanics, civilians, and the countless unnamed who refused to surrender. For the first time since 1939, Europe saw the impossible happen. Hitler's war machine had been stopped. By late August, the skies over southern England had turned into a graveyard of twisted metal and falling fire. Every day began with the same routine. Radar warnings, scramble orders, the roar of engines, and then chaos. RAF pilots fought until their ammunition ran dry, then dove home through clouds of smoke and ash. Ground crews worked without rest, hammering metal and changing engines under air raid sirens. Every man and woman in fighter command was running on fumes. The pilots, the few, as they were beginning to be called, were barely sleeping. Some were so exhausted they fell asleep in their cockpits while taxiing. They smoked endlessly, joked nervously, and took off again. Each sortie meant climbing into a sky filled with friends and enemies, knowing that many would not come back. You could always tell who'd lost someone, one pilot remembered. They just got quieter. The Germans intensified their assault. Luftwaffe formations came in waves, hammering airfields like Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, and Kenley, the very nerve centers of fighter command. Runways were cratered. Hangars burned. Fuel stores exploded in fireballs visible for miles. Yet every time the Germans thought they had destroyed an airfield, British crews patched it up overnight. Bulldozers filled craters under searchlights. Engineers hauled wrecked Spitfires into repair bays, and by dawn, the fighters were airborne again. Then came a critical shift. On August 24th, a group of German bombers, disoriented by cloud and anti-aircraft fire, accidentally dropped their payloads over London. Civilians were killed in the heart of the capital. In retaliation, the RAF bombed Berlin for the first time, an audacious strike that enraged Hitler. Furious, he ordered the Luftwaffe to abandon its attacks on airfields and instead target British cities. The Blitz had begun. It was a turning point and a deadly miscalculation. As Göring redirected his bombers toward civilian targets, the pressure on fighter command eased. Radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories, the real lifelines of Britain's defense, had a chance to recover. The Luftwaffe believed the RAF was finished, but in reality, it was regaining strength. In London, meanwhile, the war became personal. Every night, air raid sirens wailed. Families grabbed blankets and gas masks, running for underground shelters. The city's skyline flickered red as bombs fell, igniting entire streets. The smell of smoke and dust filled the tunnels of the underground, where thousands huddled shoulder to shoulder. Children clutched their mothers as explosions thundered above. Yet somehow London did not break. When dawn came, people emerged from the shelters, brushed the soot from their coats, and went to work. "Is that all you've got?" One newspaper headline famously asked Hitler. For the pilots watching from above, the sight of their burning city hardened their resolve. "It stopped being about strategy," one Spitfire pilot said. "It became about home." They fought not for medals, not even for victory, but to keep the enemy from touching the streets where their families lived. The cost was staggering. In September alone, Britain lost hundreds of fighters and dozens of irreplaceable pilots. Yet the spirit of resistance only grew stronger. Churchill's words echoed across the radio. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets." Every listener knew he meant it. The Germans believed terror would break the British will. Instead, it forged something unshakable, a collective defiance that would come to define the rest of the war. August 13th, 1940. Dawn. The Channel was calm, but in the skies over northern France, thousands of engines began to growl. Pilots fastened oxygen masks, ground crews waved them off, and the Luftwaffe took to the air. Göring had named it Adlertag, Eagle Day, the start of the great offensive that would finally crush the Royal Air Force and open the skies for invasion. By mid-morning, radar operators along Britain's coast began to see what looked like an approaching storm. Not weather, but war. The chain home stations, their giant towers silhouetted against the sky, picked up hundreds of signals. Waves of bombers, flanked by fighters, crossing the channel. Inside fighter command, telephones rang off the hook. Controllers shouted coordinates. Colored lights flashed across wall-sized maps as the defense network came alive. "This is it," someone whispered. "They're coming in force." At Tangmere, Kenley, Biggin Hill, the names that would soon become legends, pilots raced to their aircraft. Engines screamed as Spitfires and Hurricanes clawed into the air, climbing through clouds toward the incoming bombers. Within minutes, the blue summer sky over southern England turned into a swirling chaos of smoke and gunfire. For German pilots, the first shock was the ferocity of the resistance. British fighters appeared seemingly out of nowhere, guided by radar and ground control, always in the right place at the right time. "They knew we were coming," one bomber pilot later said. "It was like flying into a trap." Hurricanes dove into the bomber formations, their 8 machine guns blazing, tearing open Heinkels and Dorniers. Spitfires, faster and deadlier, tangled with Messerschmitt 109s in twisting duels that fell from the clouds like fiery comets. Below, British towns watched the battle unfold above them. Villagers pointed to contrails that crisscrossed like white scars across the blue. The roar of engines filled the air, punctuated by the rattle of machine gun fire. Occasionally, the calm was shattered by a flaming aircraft spiraling toward the earth. Friend or foe, it was impossible to tell until the wreckage hit the ground. The Luftwaffe's plan was simple but flawed. They targeted airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, believing that sustained bombing would cripple Britain's ability to fight. But radar, even when hit, was quickly repaired. And each time German pilots thought they had silenced a station, within hours it was back online, guiding fighters once again. The The system Dowding had built, radar, ground control, and rapid response, was proving its worth in real time. For the pilots, the battle was pure exhaustion. They flew sortie after sortie, refueled, rearmed, and went up again. There was no time to rest. "You didn't think about dying," one pilot recalled. "You just thought about flying straight and keeping your wingmen alive." Many never returned. Every evening, squadrons would look around the mess hall, counting empty chairs. In Germany, Göring fumed. The RAF, which was supposed to have been destroyed within days, was still fighting, harder than ever. Intelligence failures piled up. German commanders had underestimated how effective radar was and how resilient British logistics could be. Instead of collapsing, fighter command grew stronger, more efficient, and more coordinated with each engagement. By late August, the numbers were brutal. Hundreds of aircraft lost on both sides, and no sign of surrender. German aircrews began to whisper that crossing the channel felt like diving into the mouth of hell. British pilots, though battered, still rose to meet them. "They can't keep this up forever," Göring told Hitler. He was right, but it wasn't the RAF that would break first. By July 1940, the storm clouds over Britain weren't just a metaphor. They were real. Every morning, radar operators along the southern coast watched green blips move across their screens. Sometimes it was a few reconnaissance aircraft. Other times, the sky filled with entire German formations, hundreds of bombers with fighter escorts, their engines roaring across the channel like an approaching thunderstorm. Inside the dark, tense operations rooms of fighter command, women of the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, moved colored markers across a massive map table, tracking every incoming raid. Raid 52, estimated 100 plus, heading toward Dover, one would call out. Controllers barked into headsets. "Scramble! Tangmere Sector, Squadron 610, Angels 15. Within minutes, engines screamed to life. Spitfires and Hurricanes, glistening in the morning light, tore down grass runways and climbed into the sky. Above the English countryside, dogfights erupted like thunderstorms. Pilots had seconds to spot their enemy before the melee began. Twisting, diving, and rolling through vapor trails. The air was a chaos of tracers and contrails. The smell of cordite, the vibration of machine guns, the scream of wind through bullet holes. Every flight could be a pilot's last. Never fly straight and level for more than 10 seconds. Veterans warned rookies. Many didn't live long enough to learn. German bombers, flying in tight formations, were disciplined and deadly. But as they crossed the coast, RAF fighters swooped in from the sun, tearing into their ranks. Hurricanes targeted bombers. Spitfires tangled with the Bf-109 escorts. The sky became a layered chessboard of death. A Spitfire looping to protect a slower Hurricane, a Messerschmitt diving in pursuit, its engine howling. Some pilots bailed out, parachutes blooming like white flowers against the smoke. Others vanished into the sea without a trace. Below, civilians watched from fields and rooftops. Farmers paused their plows to look up as burning aircraft fell, trailing smoke like black ribbons. Children counted parachutes drifting down. Newspapers began calling the young fighter pilots the few, though no one yet knew Churchill would immortalize the phrase. But victory came at a price. The RAF was losing pilots faster than it could train them. Airfields along the coast were pockmarked with bomb craters. Mechanics worked under bombing raids, replacing engines in the dark, patching bullet holes with sheet metal and hope. The smell of fuel, sweat, and burning rubber filled every hangar. And yet, morale held. In pubs and barracks, pilots swapped stories. The thrill of a dogfight, the fear of isolation over the channel, the strange beauty of sunlight reflecting off a Messerschmitt's canopy. "We'll give them hell tomorrow," one said, raising a pint. For a moment, laughter echoed against the blackout curtains, drowning out the war outside. What the Germans didn't know was that the British were listening. Deep beneath London, in secret rooms at Bletchley Park, codebreakers were beginning to intercept and analyze Luftwaffe transmissions. Each decoded message gave fighter command just a little more warning, a few extra minutes that could mean the difference between victory and annihilation. As August approached, Hitler grew impatient. Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, promised that Britain's defenses were crumbling. "Give me 4 weeks," he boasted, "and the RAF will be destroyed." He was wrong. Britain had not yet begun to fight. In the summer of 1940, Britain stood at a crossroads. The German juggernaut had swept through Poland, Scandinavia, the Low Countries, and France. By June, the British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk and the continent lay open to German designs. Hitler's plan for an amphibious invasion of the British Isles, Operation Sea Lion, depended on one prerequisite above all: air supremacy. If the Luftwaffe could break the Royal Air Force and render the Channel unsafe for Allied shipping, invasion barges and troop convoys could cross with impunity. Thus began an epic, concentrated struggle in the skies that would be fought not on distant battlefields but over the very islands of Britain, where radar stations, airfields, and city streets alike became front-line infrastructure. This was not a conventional war of mass infantry clashes. It was a war of control in 3 dimensions: altitude, radar coverage, and time. The German strategy combined mass bomber streams with fighter escorts in the hope of overwhelming RAF sectors. For Britain, the response had to be surgical, economical, and unrelenting. The RAF, commanded by Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, relied on a then-new system of integrated air defense that married technology and human coordination. Chain-home radar stations along the eastern and southern coasts gave early warning of incoming raids, allowing fighter command to scramble fighters and vector them efficiently. Control rooms plotted blips into tracks. Sector controllers matched available squadrons to threats. Ground crew kept the aircraft in the air. In essence, Britain's defense was a choreography of limited resources executed with remarkable precision. Aircraft themselves told half the story. The Spitfire, sleek, fast, and nimble, became the symbol of aerial defiance, with a design that allowed pilots to engage in high-speed dogfights and to roll and turn with uncanny responsiveness. The Hawker Hurricane, less glamorous but more numerous, accounted for the majority of early enemy aircraft shot down. Its robust frame and easier maintenance made it the workhorse that kept squadrons operational day after day. German bombers, the Heinkel He-111, Dornier 17, and Junkers 88 were well-built and capable, but they depended on fighter protection. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, a superb single-engine fighter, was formidable. Yet when German fighter escort doctrine kept Bf-109s close to their bases across the Channel, their time over England was limited and their operational reach strained. What followed was a clash of techniques as much as hardware. The Luftwaffe tried waves of attacks, first probing raids on shipping and coastal installations, later focusing on radar and airfields to cripple Britain's detection and repair capacity. British tactics emphasized conserving pilots and aircraft by directing scrambles only where needed, using radar vectors to minimize wasted fuel and maximize interception time. Dowding's approach frustrated German attempts to win by brute force. His system turned early detection into strategic economy, allowing smaller numbers of fighters to inflict disproportionate damage. The human dimension was the heart of the battle. Britain's skies were defended by a cosmopolitan force. Royal Air Force squadrons crewed by British pilots were reinforced by men from across the Empire and occupied Europe, Poles and Czechs who had escaped Nazi conquest, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, and volunteers from other nations. These pilots brought experience, courage, and a willingness to fight despite fatigue and loss. Sorties were flown at frantic tempo. On the busiest days, individual pilots might fly multiple times, landing to refuel and rearm before heading back into combat. Ground crews worked through blackout nights, repairing bullet-ridden wings, patching fuselages, and returning aircraft to service with the urgency of a surgeon fighting against the clock. Civilians were also combatants of a kind. Blackouts blotted out towns and cities. Air raid sirens became a new rhythm. Communities dug shelters and endured incendiary raids. The Blitz, though often associated with later months, was born from the same crucible of target selection and retaliation. Instead of merely striking military objectives, German strategy later shifted to bombing cities in an attempt to break morale. Yet British society displayed resilience. Wartime propaganda and leadership, most famously Winston Churchill's defiant speeches, helped foster a determination to endure. Children attended school beneath the rumble of distant engines. Workers kept factories turning out replacements, rivets, and vital supplies. Intelligence and adaptation also played defining roles. Both sides probed each other's weaknesses. The RAF learned to rotate squadrons and to preserve seasoned pilots, while the Luftwaffe adapted tactics that sometimes exposed vulnerabilities, such as sending heavy fighters into dogfights for which they were not optimized. Weather, too, intervened. Fog, wind, and sudden cloud cover changed the outcomes of skirmishes and sometimes saved ports and airfields from catastrophic strikes. Logistics, fuel, spare parts, and a pipeline of replacement pilots was as decisive as aerial marksmanship. The battle was measured not in decisive territorial gains but in endurance and attrition of material and morale. Each damaged radar station was a blow. Each rebuilt control room a silent victory. Each pilot lost was mourned. Each surviving squadron that returned to the air was celebrated. The cumulative effect of these tactical, technical, and human efforts was the denial of air superiority to Germany. Without that supremacy, Operation Sea Lion could not proceed. What history remembers as the Battle of Britain was, therefore, not a single-pitched battle but a protracted campaign of attrition, adaptation, and unyielding will, where timing, technology, and human resolve combined to keep an island free and to alter the trajectory of the wider war.